One of the striking things about its history is, as you described, these geographic lines being drawn, setting the boundaries of a country. Those lines went through related ethnic and tribal groups and created arbitrary lines between them, so that one part of the group was in Afghanistan and another part was in Pakistan or Iran, and so on and so forth. This seems to have created an important set of ethnic affiliations and loyalties that extend beyond the borders of the state into neighboring states, and this must have an effect, of course, on the central focus on the country itself and how the various groups get along within the country.
It's true, like many colonial states or states formed in the colonial period, Afghanistan's boundaries don't necessarily make good sense. The northern boundary somewhat more so just because of the Amu Darya or Oxus River that runs along most of that boundary. Although it does divide people, there are Uzbeks in Uzbekistan and in northern Afghanistan, Turkmen in Turkmenistan and in northern Afghanistan. The most dramatic example of that, of course, is Afghanistan's eastern border with Pakistan. At the time that it was drawn, there was no Pakistan. This is before the partition of India, and it was essentially an agreement called the Durand Line, and it was really forced upon the Afghans by the British, dividing up the Pashtuns between what was then British India and Afghanistan. And Pakistan inherited that territory. And as a result, Afghanistan and Pakistan have always had some existential tension between them because many Afghans don't accept that boundary and believe that it shouldn't have been drawn there. And the Pakistanis are very sensitive about that. And so tension between Afghanistan and Pakistan really in some ways goes to the founding of Pakistan. Afghanistan was the only country to vote against Pakistan's entry into the United Nations, in part because they didn't see it as a valid boundary. And some of that tension continues. The other side of that story is not just political tension, but also the fact that you have these peoples who don't really recognize the border. The people who live along the border are simply tribes and villages divided by an invisible line, and they don't recognize it. And in many ways, that means that it's almost impossible, or is, I think, impossible to control that border and the flow of people across that border, which can be good for trade, which is what Afghanistan has always prospered from. But if you have a situation where you have militant groups on one side or the other side of the border, it's virtually impossible to control.
And as I read actually in your publication here, I believe the border between the two countries extends something like 1,500 miles. So you're talking about a very wide area of territory which is essentially uncontrollable and which has these kindred groups on both sides.
That's right. The border is enormous, and in parts runs through densely populated areas of these tribes, and other parts runs through sort of desert areas. But it's very long, and efforts to control it have really never worked.
On Afghanistan's western border, you have Iran. What has been the history of relations between those two countries? Iran having been a Shiite empire, still Shiite, but the seat of empire. Afghanistan, more majority Sunni, and of different ethnicities. What is the history of those relationships?
Iran and Afghanistan have actually had very positive relations through most of their history. And there's, I think, different reasons for that. One is that Kabul is really in the east of the country. And
the capital.
The Kabul is the capital, and Kandahar, which is the sort of the Pashtun capital, which is in the southeast of the country, they really border Pakistan. And so the political center of gravity in Afghanistan has really been much more on the eastern side. The western side has the magnificent city of Herat, which is a historical city, but a lot of the border with Iran is thinly populated and desert. And so Iran has always been very important for Afghanistan in terms of trade, but hasn't had the same political weight that the relationship with Pakistan has had.